Good evening. This is Subhash Gatade. Welcome you all to the 37th lecture in the Democracy Dialogue series, organized by New Socialist Initiative, an ideological political platform. Our guest this evening is Professor Sugata Bose, Gardiner Professor of Oceanic History and Affairs at Harvard University. We are extremely thankful to him for agreeing to be a speaker in the series and deliver a lecture. For those of you who do not know, Professor Bose belongs to a very illustrious family of freedom fighters. He is grandson of Sharat Chandra Bose, a famous Congress leader and freedom fighter, and grandnephew of legendary freedom fighter Subhash Chandra Bose, Sharad Babu's younger brother. His mother was Krishna Bose, who was member of parliament in the 11th, 12th, and 13th Lok Sabha, and he was also MP from Trinamool Congress in the 16th Lok Sabha. And as he puts it in his latest book, Asia After Europe, he chose to fight the election to challenge religious majoritarianism and centralized authoritarianism. Professor Bose was educated at Presidency College and University of Cambridge, where he did his PhD. Prior to joining Harvard, he was fellow at St. Catherine's College and professor of history and diplomacy at Tufts University. His many books include Modern South Asia, History, Culture and Political Economy with Professor Ayesha Jalal, which is going to 5th edition, 100 Horizons, the Indian Ocean in the Age of Global Empire. The third book, His Majesty's Opponent, Subhash Chandra Bose and India's Struggle Against Empire, 2011. The Nation as Mother and Other Visions of Nationhood, 2017. And the latest one, Asia After Europe, Imagining a Continent in the Long 20th Century. Professor Bose had jointly with Shishir Kumar Bose edited the 12th volume collected works of Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose. This evening, Professor Bose will be enlightening us on anti-colonial constitutionalism and the defense of India's democracy. Friends, please welcome Professor Sugata Bose. Please.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to join you from afar today to share with you my considered views on constitutionalism and the future of Indian democracy. By the time the Indian Constitution was adopted on November 26, 1949, both Mahatma Gandhi and Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose had passed from the scene. But it is worth looking to them and their socialist followers in evaluating our constitutional legacy and future. The principles and values held dear by the Mahatma and Netaji and their closest associates informed the spirit of Indian anti-colonial constitutionalism that remain our most valuable resource in the contemporary struggle for substantive democracy and genuine federalism. That spirit of constitutionalism is perhaps more salient than the letter of the Constitution. The deeply disappointing, indeed puerile and politically expedient debate in our Parliament on the 75th anniversary of the adoption of our Constitution calls for an intellectually honest appraisal of the founding moment of our Republic. When South Asia won freedom from British colonial rule in 1947, some of the finest and most far-sighted ideas in the realm of anti-colonial thought lost out in the struggle for power at the helm of post-colonial states. Foremost among these was the imperative of power-sharing arrangements between the federal center and the constituent units. The failure of the Indian National Congress and the All India Muslim League to agree on how to share power in an independent India led to a partition based on the division of the two main Muslim-majority provinces, Punjab and Bengal, along ostensibly religious lines. Partition, with its religious connotation, obfuscated provincial political dynamics that had made imaginative ideas of a federal and united India such an irresistible goal for a cross-section of anti-colonial nationalists. These political and economic ideas have acquired renewed salience in the 21st century at the vortex of a complex and symbiotic relationship between the forces of democracy and authoritarianism. We need to engage in a creative process of historical retrieval of visions for substantive democracy and federal union during the struggle for freedom that remained unrealized during the post-colonial transition. A re-engagement with those ideas will enable us to better face the challenges of authoritarianism in the present and provide the basis for a more equitable and democratic national and global order. More than 100 years ago, before resigning from the ICS, Subhash Chandra Bose wrote to Deshabandhu Chittaranjan Das from Cambridge on March 2nd, 1921. We must now craft India's constitution based on Swaraj. In fact, the letter was in Bengali. He had said that আমাদের এখন স্বরাজের ভিত্তির উপর ভারতের constitution তৈয়ারি করিতে হইবে. In the Bengali sentence, there was only one English word, constitution. He wanted the work of creation to begin even while the Congress dismantled the iniquitous colonial order. Gandhi's 1908 tract, Hind Swaraj, had provided a powerful critique of the limitations of Western parliamentary democracy and civil society. His powerful essays in Young India between 1919 and 1922, which Subhash Chandra Bose read and greatly admired, exposed the perfidy of British colonial rule, even while articulating imaginative conceptions of the contours of the Indian nation with its myriad religious and linguistic diversities. In 1920, Gandhi authored a new constitution for the Congress Party, transforming it from an elite club to a mass political organization. He introduced the linguistic principle to undergird provincial Congress organizations and envisioned linguistic states once freedom was won. In this constitution that he composed, the language of several northern and central Indian provinces was stated to be Hindustani, not Hindi. Constitutional reforms in British India during the early 20th century, in 1909, 1919, and 1935, had introduced elements of limited representative government while denying substantive democracy. These were measures to protect and perpetuate colonial rule under changed political circumstances of an intensifying nationalist challenge. The British alternated between attempts at communalizing and provincializing Indian representative politics in order to keep power at the All India Centre firmly in their own hands. Since 1909, separate electorates were introduced for religious minorities. The 1919 and 1935 legislations sought to direct Indian political attention towards local and provincial arenas. The Indian National Congress, led by Mahatma Gandhi from 1920 onwards, orchestrated mass movements across the country to circumvent the constraints of the representative institutions with very restricted electorates set up by the British Raj. The best in Indian political thought categorically rejected the constitutional devices of 1909, 1919, and 1935 that were designed to perpetuate British colonial rule. Against these British attempts to impose centralized despotism, patriotic Indians forged what a young historian, Aniket De, has called a robust political tradition of anti-colonial constitutionalism since the days of the Swadeshi movement of 1905. He has also drawn a distinction between the racialized imperial lineage of diarchy and federation on the one hand, and an anti-colonial lineage of federalism on the basis of Indian unity. The very term Sanbidhan, as distinct from Shashantantra, comes from Rabindranath Tagore's essays in Swadeshi Samaj on village confederations. In fact, the blueprint of a federal constitution was unveiled by the Swarajists led by Deshabandhu and Subhash Chandra Bose in 1923, alongside a pact for the equitable sharing of power between Hindus and Muslims. According to this remarkable Swaraj constitution, the ordinary work of a central government in free India should be mainly advisory. It called for a maximum of local autonomy, carried on mainly with advice and coordination from, and only a minimum of control by higher centers. There were many such creative constitutions that did the rounds in those days, particularly the 1920s, the Hindustan Republic, the Socialist Republican Association, for example, Ubaidullah Sindhi, and of course, M.N. Roy in 1928 called for a popularly elected Constituent Assembly. Indians learned the value of democracy less from its example in the metropolis and more from the practice of authoritarianism in the colony. The rule of colonial difference had ensured that what was good for the metropolis was not considered good for the colony. Democracy, as Subhash Chandra Bose put it in 1928 in his presidential address to the Maharashtra Provincial Political Conference in Pune, is by this no means a Western institution. It is a human institution. India, he believed, should become, quote, an independent federal republic, unquote. He warned Indian nationalists not to become a queer mixture of political democrats and social conservatives. He explained, if we want to make India really great, we must build up a political democracy on the pedestal of a democratic society. Privileges based on birth, caste, or creed should go, and equal opportunities should be thrown open to all irrespective of caste, creed, or religion. The status of women should be raised, and women should be trained to take larger and a more intelligent interest in public affairs. Once the pledge of Purna Swaraj was taken, 26th January was observed as our Independence Day from 1930 to 1947. The Congress worked the provincial part of the 1935 Act for what it was worth and opposed the British plan to bring in the autocratic princes to counterbalance the democratically elected representatives from the provinces in a future federation. We have made some serious study of history and politics, Subhash Chandra Bose wrote on December 26, 1939. And in our view, a Constituent Assembly, if it is not a misnomer, can come into existence only after the seizure of power. He compared the Congress proposal at that time of a Constituent Assembly under the aegis of an imperialist government to the Irish Convention created by Lloyd George, and feared that it, quote, may in time prove to be the greatest fraud perpetrated on the Indian people by their own leaders, unquote. By contrast, he lauded the Sinn Féin's decision to stay away from Lloyd George's Irish Convention and the Bolshevik move to withdraw from the Russian Constituent Assembly. In his Azad Hind Fauj and government, Netaji achieved unity on the basis of equality among all religious communities and linguistic groups in a manner perhaps no other leader had been able to accomplish. As for Gandhi, he wrote to Jawaharlal Nehru after the end of World War II on October 5th, 1945, I still stand by the system of government envisaged in Hind Swaraj. I have not Hind Swaraj before me as I write. It is really better for me to draw the picture anew in my own words. And whether it is the same as I drew in Hind Swaraj or not is immaterial. I am convinced that if India is to attain true freedom, and through India the world also, then sooner or later the fact must be recognized that people have to live in villages, not in towns, in huts, not in palaces. I do not want to draw a large-scale picture in detail. It is possible to envisage railways, post and telegraph offices, etc. For me, it is material to obtain the real article, and the rest will fit into the picture afterwards. So here, Gandhi was not really saying that he did not want a large-scale picture to emerge in due course. He just wanted the real article first. A focus on the contrast between Gandhi's localism and Nehru's centralism has distracted attention from many creative constitutional visions of India's federal unity articulated by a range of other leaders, including Deshabandhu and Netaji. We never had a popularly elected Constituent Assembly of the sort that M.N. Roy and Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose had wanted. With independence on the horizon, an indirectly elected Constituent Assembly from the provincial legislatures, based on a very limited franchise, was convened on December 9, 1946, to begin the task of laying the constitutional foundation of India's democracy. On November 26, 1949, the Constituent Assembly adopted a set of principles enshrined in a lengthy written document that have guided India's political destiny for 75 years. The Republic envisioned in the Constitution was formally inaugurated on January 26, 1950. Its most far-reaching and bold provision was for a universal adult franchise in a country with a literacy rate hovering near 12%. It also wisely provided for reservations in the legislatures for the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes, a principle that had been agreed upon in the Pune Pact of 1932. India was fortunate that as a result of Gandhi's open-mindedness, a stringent critic of mainstream nationalism, the depressed classes leader Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, placed his intellectual prowess at the service of the nation for 5 years, from December 9, 1946 to October 12, 1951, when he resigned as law minister from Jawaharlal Nehru's cabinet in protest against conservative opposition to the reformist Hindu Code Bill. It is pertinent to recall what Ambedkar said on the question of minority protection while introducing the draft constitution on November 4, 1948. To diehards who have developed a kind of fanaticism against minority protection, he declared, I would like to say two things. One is that minorities are an explosive force, which if it erupts can blow up the whole fabric of the state. The other is that the minorities in India have agreed to place their existence in the hands of the majority. They have loyally accepted the rule of the majority, which is basically a communal majority and not a political majority. It is for the majority to realize its duty not to discriminate against minorities. However, the Constitution did away with separate electorates and did not accept reservations for disadvantaged religious minorities. In the same speech, Ambedkar tried to respond to critics who asserted that there was nothing new in the draft constitution, that about half of it has been copied from the Government of India Act of 1935, and that the rest of it has been borrowed from the constitutions of other countries. Ambedkar explained that he had borrowed and not plagiarized. He was only sorry that the provisions taken from the Government of India Act 1935 related mostly to the details of administration. He agreed that ideally administrative details should have no place in the Constitution, but argued that it was necessary in the Indian situation. It was in this context that Ambedkar invoked the concept of constitutional morality described by Grote, the historian of Greece. However, Grote had written of a situation where people were supposedly saturated with constitutional morality and could therefore take the risk of omitting details of the administration from the Constitution. In India of the late 1940s, Ambedkar believed that such a diffusion of constitutional morality could not be presumed. Constitutional morality, he contended, is not a natural sentiment. It has to be cultivated. We must realize that our people have yet to learn it. Ambedkar followed up this contention with a debatable proposition. Democracy in India is only a top dressing on an Indian soil, which is essentially undemocratic. In today's climate, some would probably label him unpatriotic or anti-national for having said so. But a mature democracy ought to ponder over his remark and embrace the value of constitutional morality as respect for forms and processes that enable the negotiation, adjudication, and resolution of differences by transcending what Grote described as the bitterness of party contest. In the course of the Constituent Assembly debates, another eloquent member, Zairul Hasan Lari, pointed out that the constitutional morality was a value that not just citizens, but also the government must learn. Just because the government has the power to act, it does not mean it should. The spirit underlying the Constitution, and not just the words, must guide and restrain the government. If Ambedkar had profound insights into just representation for subordinated castes and the value of constitutional morality, the majority in the Constituent Assembly collectively fell short on the question of emergency provisions and federalism. The Constitution was framed under the dark shadow of the dislocations wrought by partition. Mahatma Gandhi's assassination and the loss and division of the Muslim majority provinces reduced the voices that would have argued against an over-centralizing impulse. Ambedkar was originally elected to the Constituent Assembly from Bengal, thanks to the magnanimity of the scheduled caste leaders led by Jogendranath Mondal. The list of members who registered and presented their credentials on December 9, 1946, from Bengal, had been a veritable roll of honor. It read as follows, and I saw this when I was in sort of Parliament, the actual original document. Bengal, 1, Mr. Sharath Chandra Bose, 2, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, 3, Mr. Kiran Shankar Roy, 4, Mr. Frank Reginald Anthony, 5, Mr. Shatyaranjan Bakshi, 6, Dr. Prafulla Chandra Ghosh. The list included 25 members from Bengal, including the distinguished communist leader Somnath Lahiri. Once the partitioner's axe fell on Bengal, the Jessore and Khulna constituency that Ambedkar represented through an indirect election was given away to the new Constituent Assembly of Pakistan. At that moment, in July 1947, Ambedkar had to be hastily re-elected from Bombay province to a seat vacated by M.R. Jayakar. Sharath Chandra Bose resigned from the Constituent Assembly in 1947 once the Congress High Command, with no reference to Mahatma Gandhi, called for the partition of Punjab and Bengal. Gandhi's erstwhile yes-men had now turned into his no-men. On the last day of his life, January 30th, 1948, the Mahatma spent some time drafting a new constitution for the Congress Party, suited to the new era of freedom. Ambedkar candidly acknowledged that the Indian Constitution, unlike the American one, was not cast in the pure federal mold. The Constitution of India, he claimed, can be both unitary as well as federal according to the requirements of time and circumstances. In normal times, it is framed to work as a federal system, but in times of war, it is so designed as to make it work as though it was a unitary system. Once the President issues a proclamation, which he is authorized to do under the provisions of Article 275, this was the draft article, he went on to say the whole scene can become transformed and the state becomes a unitary state. We now know from what transpired between 1975 and 1977 how this lacuna in the form of emergency provisions can allow authoritarianism to get the better of both federalism and democracy in times of peace. Even fundamental rights are not as inviolable in the Indian Constitution as the Bill of Rights in the United States. Though imbibing the principles of democratic constitutions, Ashok Chandra wrote in his wonderful 1965 book, Federalism in India, the Indian Constitution is not altogether free from authoritarian trends, which it inherited in accepting the basis of the 1935 Act. Until 1965, there was a lively intellectual tradition of critical scholarship on the Indian Constitution. The following year, and in this scholarship, many self-described socialists made important contributions. The following year, Granville Austin's rather mediocre The Indian Constitution, Cornerstone of a Nation was published. Austin was a US State Department employee in the 1950s and 1960s. This foreigner's praise of the supposed liberal features of the Constitution was lapped up in Indian ruling circles. Austin made light of the objections raised in the Constituent Assembly to the inclusion of the emergency provisions, which were to be invoked within a decade of the publication of his book. Did no one in the Constituent Assembly foresee the dangers posed to federalism and democracy by the states of exception written into the Constitution? A few, especially ardent disciples of the Mahatma and Netaji, did, but their far-sighted amendments were typically voted down or negatived, to use the parliamentary jargon. K.T. Shah, whom Netaji had inducted into the National Planning Committee in 1938, brought an amendment to Article 1 to proclaim, India shall be a secular, federal, socialist union of states. India shall be a secular, federal, socialist union of states. It was not accepted. He also wanted to categorically deny the center any authority to change the name, boundary, or status of any state without the explicit permission of the state legislature. Hari Vishnu Kamath, a close associate of Subhash Chandra Bose during the freedom struggle, rang the alarm bells during the debate on draft Article 275 on August 2nd, 1949. I have ransacked most of the constitutions of democratic countries of the world, monarchic or republican, and I find no parallel to this chapter on emergency provisions in any of the other constitutions of democratic countries in the world. The closest approximation to my mind is reached in the Weimar Constitution of the Third Reich, which was destroyed by Hitler, taking advantage of the very same provisions contained in the Constitution. The Weimar Constitution of the Third Republic exists no longer and has been replaced by the Bonn Constitution. But those emergency provisions pale into insignificance when compared with the emergency provisions in this chapter of our Constitution. Ambedkar's colleague T.T. Krishnamachari made light of the constitutional dictatorship envisaged in Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution. Kamath intervened once more to say to Krishnamachari that the point I made out with reference to Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution is that Hitler used those very provisions to establish his dictatorship. Ambedkar reckoned much time had been taken up in the debate and thought that no reply was necessary because Mr. T.T. Krishnamachari had replied to the points already. The President of the Constituent Assembly, Rajendra Prasad, terminated the debate with a show of some impatience. The Constituent Assembly passed the motion empowering the President to proclaim an emergency if the security of India was threatened, whether by war or external aggression or internal disturbance, or if he was satisfied there was imminent danger thereof. The next day, Kamath rose to the defense of federalism during the debate on draft Article 277A that would let the Union government intervene in the internal affairs of states in case of internal disturbance. He brought an amendment to replace that phrase with internal insurrection or chaos. The article proposed intervention by the President on receipt of a report from the state governor or otherwise. Kamath considered otherwise to be a mischievous word. He refused to be party to such a foul transaction, setting at naught the scheme of even the limited provincial autonomy which we have provided for in this Constitution, and I shall pray to God that he may grant sufficient wisdom to this House to see the folly, the stupidity, the criminal nature of this transaction. Kamath received some support from K.T. Shah, Shibanlal Saxena, Hridayanath Kunzru, Renuka Rai, and Vishwanath Das, who was a former Premier of Orissa, in taking a stand against the over-centralizing tendencies. They were outvoted, and Kamath's plea to lay the foundation of a real democracy sounded like a voice in the wilderness. I do not altogether deny, Ambedkar conceded, that there is a possibility of these articles being abused or employed for political purposes. The proper thing we ought to expect is that such articles will never be called into operation and that they would remain a dead letter. They would remain a dead letter. That was, of course, a pious hope waiting to be belied. We should also ponder whether the authorship of clauses that he wanted to be a dead letter should be thrust on the chairman of the drafting committee. The proceedings of this Constituent Assembly would have been very dull, Ambedkar said in his final speech in the Constituent Assembly, if all members had yielded to the rule of party discipline. Party discipline in all its rigidity would have converted this assembly into a gathering of yes-men. Fortunately, there were rebels. He went on to list by name Hari Vishnu Kamath, Dr. P.S. Deshmukh, R.K. Sidhwa, Professor Shibanlal Saxena, Pandit Thakurdas Bhargava, Professor K.T. Shah, and Pandit Hridayanath Kunzru. Now, none of these names were even mentioned in the debate that took place on the 75th anniversary of the adoption of the Constitution. That I was not prepared to accept their suggestions, Ambedkar generously stated, does not diminish the value of their suggestions, nor lessen the service they have rendered to the Assembly in enlivening its proceedings. Reduced to enlivening the proceedings rather than contributing to the substance of the final product, the rebels did not disguise their feelings of regret that their amendments were rejected. K.T. Shah, the opposition's first presidential candidate against Rajendra Prasad, had warned that, and I quote, "In the Constitution as it stands, there is room rather for the development of fascism than for the development of a working real democracy," unquote, since the Prime Minister had been given the powers to become, quote, an actual dictator, and the Cabinet and Parliament nothing but the registry office of such a dictator, unquote. Shibanlal Saxena, the Gandhian, who spent 10 years of his young life in prison dungeons and condemned cells during British rule, called the provision for suspension of the right of habeas corpus the darkest blot. I could never have conceived that in the Constitution of Free India, he lamented, detention without trial will be permitted under the fundamental rights of the people. Rising to extend limited and qualified support to the motion moved by Ambedkar to pass the Constitution, Kamath suggested that we, the people of India, had come to the end of a long journey, which was, however, the beginning of a longer, a more arduous, and a more hazardous one. True to the Indian genius, he noted, our struggle, our awakening began with the spiritual renaissance which was pioneered by Ramakrishna Paramhansa, Swami Vivekananda, and Swami Dayananda. In the wake of those spiritual leaders came the political renaissance and the cultural renaissance, of which the torchbearers, the leaders, the guides were Lokmanya Tilak, Aurobindo, and Mahatma Gandhi, and last but not the least, Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose. He recalled the part played in the freedom struggle by Sheikh Abdullah in Kashmir and Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan and his brother Dr. Khan Sahib in the Northwest Frontier Province. That part of India is with us, Kamath said, but our hope and our faith is that whatever the differences between the part that has gone from us and the part that still remains to us, those differences will be removed, will be smoothened, and our relations will become happier day by day, and Pakistan and India will live on the most cordial terms as years roll by. Now, as we know, that did not happen, and we simply have an occasional cricket match between the two countries. The constitution that had been settled by the Assembly, he described as, quote, a centralized federation with a facade of parliamentary democracy, unquote. He and his friends, Shibanlal Saxena, P.S. Deshmukh, R.K. Sidhwa, Mahavir Tyagi, Thakurdas Bhargava, Naziruddin Ahmed of Bengal, K.T. Shah, Hridayanath Kunzru, and Brajeshwar Prasad had all tried to make the constitution conform to the preamble, but found that the horoscope of the drafting committee was strong. The Congress High Command, ignoring Mahatma Gandhi, had insisted on partition and inherited the unitary centre of the British Raj. The spectre of partition violence was invoked to further bolster centralized state authority and entrench emergency powers in the Constitution. Partition had depleted the ranks of federalists in the Indian Constituent Assembly. Only a few ethical and eloquent voices arguing for greater democracy and federalism remained. As I have shown, Kamath inside the Constituent Assembly argued strenuously against the emergency provisions and also the centralizing impulse. Part 18 of the Constitution, conferring emergency powers upon the President, Sharat Chandra Bose wrote in a critique in January 1950 in the Indian Law Review, has a remarkable family likeness to Section 42, 43, and 45 of the Government of India Act 1935, the quintessence of which is reincarnated in our Constitution with a minimum of verbal changes. He described the emergency provisions as, quote, time bombs, unquote. He further pointed out, and this is in fact more important, that Article 21 of the Constitution does not secure due process of law. It secures procedural process only. Does not secure due process of law, it secures procedural process only. This lacuna enabled the suspension of the fundamental right to life and liberty in 1975 and played a key role in the Supreme Court's ruling on habeas corpus. During the 1975 to 77 emergency, the suspension of habeas corpus was deemed to be constitutional by 4 out of 5 judges of the Supreme Court, with only Justice H.R. Khanna, the uncle of our present Chief Justice, dissenting. The breakdown of India's democracy in 1975 and also current authoritarian trends have deep historical roots in colonial jurisprudence that formed part of the basis of our post-colonial republic. Either sheer lack of knowledge or deliberate obfuscation of this history has resulted in some shallow, uncritical commentary on the Republic's founding moment. In my most recent book, Asia After Europe, I have written about one of the most insightful and entertaining of the early 1950s accounts of China, written by K.T. Shah in the style of a diarist, light and discursive, rather than labored, scientific, or obviously didactic. K.T. Shah had worked closely with both Bose and Nehru during the freedom struggle. He broke with Nehru, along with other socialists like the scientist Meghnad Shah, when the first Indian Prime Minister appeared to prefer post-colonial continuity to a radical departure from the colonial past. As we have seen, Shah was one of the most eloquent proponents of a democratic, secular, federal, and socialist India, alongside a few far-sighted colleagues, including Kamath in the Constituent Assembly between 1946 and 1949. The Constitution, in the view of these conscientious dissenters, retained too many states of exception inherited from colonial structures of state authority. K.T. Shah lost as an independent to a far less distinguished candidate belonging to the Congress in the first general elections in India, as did B.R. Ambedkar, who had come to a temporary accommodation with the Congress leadership during the constitution-making process. Shah was chosen as the opposition candidate to run as an independent in the first presidential election in 1952 against Rajendra Prasad, who was the Congress nominee. Meghnad Shah, his friend and colleague from their National Planning Committee days, and now a member of parliament from Bengal, had put forward his name. He did not have a chance of winning in an indirect election by parliamentarians and state legislators to the top constitutional post. Though our homemade constitution assures freedom of speech and expression as among the fundamental rights of citizens of India, he wrote, there are so many limitations and restrictions that the true soul of freedom is overladen and obscured by the miasma of these exceptions. One of his fellow delegates to China was his colleague in the Constituent Assembly, Shiban Lal Saxena, who, despite his excellent record of service and sacrifice in the days of active struggle, had been defeated at the polls by a common and garden variety of congressmen. While the common program in China postulates democratic centralism and yet provides for such a considerable autonomy for local governing bodies, Shah observed, we in India talk of real democracy and yet so effectively centralize the real power, authority and resources of government as to make of provincial autonomy or municipal and village self-government a tragic farce. On his return to India, K.T. Shah briefed Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru on his tour of China. Naturally, he listened without any comment, Shah noted, but I felt I had discharged a duty of every citizen of a free country in my position should take upon himself. Mahatma Gandhi, before his death, had personally advised him always to do so, whether his suggestions were accepted or not. The words of the preamble of our Constitution are indeed very beautiful and inspirational. However, there are also key features of the Constitution, those parts inherited from the colonial era that do not conform to the ideals enunciated in the preamble. That is why a young legal scholar, Oceanic, has titled his recent book, The Colonial Constitution. Our idealistic students and youth who go out into the streets to recite the preamble can be imprisoned without trial by deploying lawless laws enabled by that same constitution. In July 2019, the government railroaded through Parliament an amendment to the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act that empowered the regime to proclaim an individual a terrorist and hold such a person in detention without trial. This law bore a striking resemblance to the Rowlatt Act of 100 years ago, 1919, against which Gandhi had launched his first All India Satyagraha. The Mahatma had dubbed it a lawless law, enacted by a satanic government. How can we forget that the same body as the Constituent Assembly, sitting as our provisional parliament, passed the most draconian Preventive Detention Act in February 1950, drawing on all the worst features of colonial authoritarianism. To be able to strengthen democracy, it is necessary to draw upon an alternative, enlightened political tradition of anti-colonial constitutionalism. If we want to build democratic resistance to religious majoritarianism and centralized authoritarianism, a status quoist position on the colonial inheritances in our constitution will lead to abject failure. Let us instead take our stand on the best moral values of the freedom struggle, ingrained in our tradition of anti-colonial constitutionalism, of which Mahatma Gandhi and Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose were shining stars. The current young generation have a right and a duty to have a say in the kind of constitutional structure under which our country will be governed in 2050. Whatever happens in the battle being fought in the trenches of party politics, we can still win the battle of ideas over the next quarter of a century and build a truly democratic, federal, and egalitarian India through judicious amendments that will preserve and strengthen protections for Dalits and other marginalized communities, while at the same time decolonizing clauses that enable authoritarian rule under the guise of democracy. There can always be good or bad amendments to the Constitution as a living organism. The first and 42nd amendments were, in my view, bad ones. I played a role in the passage of the 100th Amendment in 2015 that ratified the India-Bangladesh Land Boundary Agreement, which was, I believe, in our national interest. We should ensure that the letter of the Constitution accords fully with the spirit articulated beautifully in its preamble. Most important, Indian unity can only be of the federal type. We need to bolster the federal features of our state and polity. That is the need of the hour. Let us therefore craft our constitutional structure and future on the basis of Swaraj that Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose had called for more than 100 years ago. Thank you.
Professor Sugata Bose, for this very interesting and very thought-provoking presentation. You raised many issues about which many of us had not thought over about it. So we'll be starting the discussion on your presentation, and I will request Hamid Ansari Saab is here. Hamid Ansari, so I will request him if he's there, unmute himself and share his comment and views. Hamid Ansari Saab.
What Professor Bose has said are things which can be discerned from the debates, but unfortunately, the political alignment of the time did not go in the right direction. He is very correct in saying that the spirit of the preamble has not been fully reflected. I think Ambedkar pointed out some aspects of it, but this is the difficulty, and time has shown that his apprehensions or the views of Professor K.T. Shah time has sustained them.
Yes. It is wonderful to hear from you, Hamid Ansari Sahab. And, I just am wanting to have an intellectually honest reappraisal of that moment so that we are better prepared to challenge some of the authoritarian trends today?
No, Professor Bose, you're right. I think we got derailed. We don't
Yeah.
concede it easily, but that derailment is beginning to show itself, the extent of that derailment. And a constitutional dictatorship is what we are slipping into.
Mhm.
That's my own view at the moment.
Mhm. Yeah, and that is why I think we need to have a discerning view of the letter of the Constitution. I mean, there is much that is helpful, that is very good. On the other hand, there are features, because it was so much of a colonial inheritance from the 1935 Act, that any authoritarian regime can use to establish what Hamid Ansari Sahab has called a constitutional dictatorship. So it can be a dictatorship, but our judiciary will look just at the letter of the clauses of the Constitution and say that, okay, this is constitutional. But that may not be genuinely and substantively democratic. So that,
Exactly what is happening.
Yeah.
That's what is happening.
Yes.
I will request Harman Sukhia Saab to unmute himself and share his comment. Harman Saab.
Thank you very much. First, of course, it was a wonderful lecture we heard, as one was expected. My only sort of somewhat, what shall I say, pessimistic reaction is that, what Professor Bose has indicated depends on, it's a very optimistic kind of, I find it very optimistic kind of direction that he has given, namely optimistic in the sense that whatever the political parties are doing and governments are doing and so on, but the people of India have to take up this challenge to to bring constitutional back on track and establish a constitutional democracy rather than constitutional dictatorship as being established and exercised all the time. But I think my pessimistic reaction is, I'm sorry for being pessimistic, is that it's the people of India who are endorsing, in a way, the kind of constitutional dictatorship that's being practiced here. So how do people of India take up a challenge that Professor Bose has posed? How do they take it up and lead to very radical changes, not in the Constitution so much, in the working of the Constitution, in the actual functioning of the Constitution? I'm not very hopeful that we'll be able to do it in the next 20 years or 30 years or 50 years or whatever. I think it's a much longer project that he has proposed, and I think which is in a way fair enough, because these things take very, very long time. But thank you very much for letting me in and listening to a wonderful lecture.
Well, Dr. Harban Smukia, I mean, there are good reasons for your pessimism. And, one, of course, is that if you look at the current configuration of political forces in our country, then, I'm quite aware that any constitutional changes may, in fact, go in the wrong direction, not in the direction which I was indicating, making our constitutional structure more democratic, more federal, more egalitarian, and so on. And the other reason for your pessimism is something that I don't fully share, which is that you are saying that the people of India seem to be endorsing this kind of drift towards authoritarianism. And I can see, where you are coming from, because after all, these days when, democracy is put under siege, it is not by military coups or military dictatorships, but we have elected,
Exactly.
democratically elected authoritarian leaders in so many countries of the world, including the country from which I'm speaking right now. Uh, and so, so is that to be accepted as straightforwardly popular endorsement? Um, um, I have more faith in the people in the sense that we never had a fully popularly elected Constituent Assembly, and therefore these people are living under constitutional structures that were established in the past. And also, I think the opposition would have a role to play. And the reason why I gave a lecture of this kind is because, as I pointed out, there is too much of a status quoist position that is being taken. Just carrying the Constitution around and showing it to people, that will not do. And that is a recipe for failure. And it is much more important to actually provide sort of an alternative vision of our political future, place it before the people. And I really think that uh, if we can place, a blueprint for a genuinely federal, democratic, egalitarian India in front of the people, there will be
How,
some resonance.
how do
Yeah,
you place it?
yeah,
By writing
yeah.
articles.
Yeah, I can see why you're being so pessimistic. In this present moment, it is hard to be optimistic. But
Indeed,
I'll tell
yes.
you where
Thank
I'm
you.
coming from. When I rose to give my first speech in Parliament in 2014, I looked around me, and of course, on the opposition benches, there was complete pessimism, and therefore, I almost felt that I had to give a speech which would be somewhat uplifting and at least introduce a grain of optimism for the future. So, yeah.
Thank you.
I will request Ravi, our friend.
Uh, Professor Bose, thank you so much for accepting our invitation. And if you can hear me, wonderful lecture. And thanks once again for accepting our invitation. Let me put a question, which may be partly, even though only partly, but it's still partly devil's advocate. You are right now, we are living under a democratically elected authoritarian ruler. Whatever part of lecture I could hear today, I unfortunately, because I couldn't hear the whole thing, listen to the whole thing, but you are placing your hope um, in the masses. You were earlier referring to Mahatma Gandhi. You are placing your hope in federalism, federal structure. But if I were to ask that in India, there is no regional party. If I connect existence of regional parties with federalism or aspects of federalism to some extent, there is no regional party which is ideological and which is a staunch defender of democracy. And as far as mass mobilization is concerned, the Babri Masjid demolition movement was one of the largest mass mobilization India has seen. And these Hindutva authoritarian leaders, they have a large mass following. It seems to me that India is fortunate to have democracy because of our national struggle leaders of that national movement. But the democratic structure as well as democratic values came from top. They did not arise from the masses as such, or they did not arise from those identities which could then feed into some federal structure. So, as a devil's advocate, if I were to say that both your expectations that masses will safeguard democracy and federalism will safeguard democracy. But the history shows that the democratic elite enlightened democratic elite brought democratic structure, constitutional democratic structure to us. And as long as they had the ideological hegemony, democracy was doing better. But when democracy became intensely competitive and struck its roots in India, then the society threw up these authoritarian leaders or these majoritarian bigoted leaders through the democratic process. So if I were to say that if you place your hope in federalism, in masses, and in a properly made constitution, then none of those three things, give me hope. What gives me hope is the enlightened democratic political force which struggles hard to convince the masses to come on the side of enlightened democracy. And that kind of political force right now has been facing problems or has been defeated at the hand of. So if I were to, just as a devil's advocate, I were to challenge you that your hopes in federalism and masses are maybe too optimistic, as Professor Mukhia is saying, what would you say?
Well, again, I accept that we are living in a moment when there are many reasons to feel not just pessimistic, but downright gloomy. But first of all, I agree with your diagnosis that we at this moment have democratically elected authoritarian regime and leader. And it's not just in India. There are so many countries which have gone in that same direction. It's almost a global phenomenon right now. And as a result, because they have a certain degree of popular sanction, they are winning elections. It might also lead us to completely lose faith in the masses, as you're putting it. And, I read that quotation from K.T. Shah because he had in some ways anticipated that even within the letter of the Constitution, it's possible for the Prime Minister to become an actual dictator, and the Parliament and Cabinet a kind of registry office. It was remarkably prescient of him to say so. And I also accept that currently, if you look at the regional parties or even opposition parties as a whole, they are not necessarily ideological. And the federalism that I was envisioning was not just about autonomy for the regions or the states. What I was thinking of was how to, equitably share power at a federal center. And this will become a very major issue in terms of the relationship between the north and south of our country. If in 2026 there is going to be a delimitation, and we have to be imaginative about introducing constitutional structures that don't let the people of our southern states feel that they are being disenfranchised or being left out of a legitimate share of power at an all-India federal center. Now, what you are calling for, in some ways, is for some kind of a vanguard, an intellectual vanguard, if you will. And in some ways, I was doing exactly that. That there has to be sort of an intellectual leadership, placing creative ideas for a democratic future before the people. So I see the relationship between intellectual elites, if you will, and the people to be a dialectical one. And this is an effort that we must make. What are we doing here today? We are about 51 people talking over Zoom, and possibly all of us belong to some kind of an intellectual elite. But we have to make the connection with those, who vote in governments to reach out to people. And I think that one of the worst features of what's going on in this age of democratic authoritarianism is, growing inequality and injustice done towards the masses of the people. And I don't believe that this level of inequality is sustainable, and that the people will not tolerate it beyond a certain point. And that is why I don't think that the position that you're taking and what I broached are irreconcilable. I'm not placing a sort of a romantic sort of kind of a hope in the masses to rise up or to see some of the true dangers of this current phase of authoritarianism. I do think that there will need to be intellectual leadership as well. And I hope that these two strands can be brought together in a more effective way than is being done at the present. I'm saying all of this because, what causes me to be somewhat pessimistic, even though I'm a born optimist, is not so much the authoritarianism of those who are ruling us today, but the ineffectiveness of the democratic opposition. And that is why I'm suggesting that we need to come forward with new ideas that might galvanize a more robust political opposition in our country and elsewhere.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I would request my friend Bhargav to take up questions in the chat box. Bhargav, please go ahead.
Thank you, Subhash. Thank you, Professor Bose, for this wonderful and very thought-provoking discussion lecture. And I am going to read a question from chat box now. There is a question from a friend called Sridhar. I am going to read it. Lovely speech and discussion. Two short questions. One, can you trace how the term federal in India come to mean state rights, whereas in many other countries, federal refers to the central or union and not state rights? How did this come about historically? And second question, can we envisage a push for federal constitutionalism without a federal politics? The fuel for federal politics is regional identity. Are we ready to understand India as a country of many nationalities? Apart from a few states, most of the North and Central Indian states lack such a national identity. I ask this as a Tamilian who believes strongly for greater state rights.
Yes. The term federal has a long history, and it was deployed effectively and creatively by many eminent political thinkers and leaders in our country, certainly in the first few decades of the 20th century. Now, you say that the term federal refers to the center in many other contexts, which is true, but we talk about a federal center, when there is an acceptance that the states have come together to form a union. So, for example, in the United States, where I am, the government in Washington is referred to as the federal government. And that goes back to the times when the 13 colonies came together to form the United States of America. And of course, in the United States, even if you think about the US Senate, it has equal representation for all states, big and small. So New York and California have two senators each, as do, let's say, Delaware and Maine. So federal referring to the center came about when, a union was forged from below. But in India, I think there were, many other local words in Indian languages that were being used. The term that was used in Bengal was Milan, union, rather than federalism. But whenever they had to translate, whenever they had to write in English, the term federal was used as the closest approximation. So that's why, just think of somebody like Bipin Pal talking about federalism in his book, The Soul of India, at the very beginning of the 20th century. And what he said, where is this name Bharat or Bharatvarsha coming from? He says that it is derived from a legendary king called Bharat. And who was Bharat? He was nothing but a king at the center of a circle of kings. So, sovereignty was layered and shared in India. And he then went on to argue that under Muslim sovereigns, including the Mughals, you have the same thing. The emperor is simply a king at the center of a circle of kings. And so he went on to argue that Indian unity can only be of the federal type, that you must acknowledge the autonomy of the states, which will then come together to form an overarching Indian union. And all of the constitutions that I referred to of the interwar period typically were envisioning what was explicitly called the United States of India. And and this was philosophically also accepted by somebody like Rabindranath Tagore, when he said in his essays on Bharatvarsha in the 1910s that, where there is genuine difference, it is only by accommodating that difference and then restraining it in its proper place that you can achieve unity. You can never achieve real unity by issuing legal fiats from above that everybody is one. So, there was this notion that India should be a federal union of states. That was the dominant current in anti-colonial political thought, I would say in the first few decades of the 20th century. And this is a key feature of anti-colonial constitutionalism. Now, you asked this question as a Tamilian, and in some ways I would say, Tamil Nadu is probably the only state which is genuinely, standing up for the rights of the states, even in today's politics, and it has a long history, going back to Periyar and Annadurai and so on, and it is a pity that many of the other regional parties are not fundamentally, ideological, are not even aware of the history of political thought relating to federalism that might, in fact, sustain their politics in a much healthier and a better way. But even in the case of Tamil Nadu, what I would say is that ultimately, federalism has to be not just about the states' rights, the legitimate defense of the rights of, let's say, the state of Tamil Nadu. But if authoritarianism at the all India level has to be challenged, there would have to be a genuine federal front which also talks about the proper, equitable, legitimate sharing of power at a federal center. So that is where the idea of federalism as states' rights and federalism as a renegotiation of sharing out of power at the center comes together. So federalism bridges, these two dimensions. And I really think this will become extremely important, particularly from 2026 onwards. And if the South cannot come forward with really compelling constitutional visions, which will give them perhaps weighted representation at a federal center, perhaps in an upper house, and so on, then it will mean real trouble for our union, because there will be a sense among people of the South that they are being deprived for having been successful in many other different ways, simply on demographic grounds of being shut out of what they see as a legitimate share of power in a union.
We have with us Anil Noria Saab. He is a legal scholar and columnist. I will request him to unmute himself and share his views. And
well, thank you. I really enjoyed the lecture, and I think I agree with most of the things that were said. So I would only say that there is this question of how easily the judiciary and the executive and the election commission have collapsed. I'm deliberately using the word collapse. You saw just earlier this week how the election commission case was dealt with by the Supreme Court, where the question of the composition of the panel to appoint the new election commissioners was in question, and how the court just passed the buck, pushed the case forward, didn't go into it in time, and so on. So really, when one of the participants said this kind of politics has popular endorsement, I would qualify that, as Professor Bose also did, to say that actually this is so-called popular endorsement is being mediated through the collapse of a couple of very key institutions. And the question is what to do about these institutions. What is the kind of pressure that can be brought to bear, not just at election time, but all the time, on the performance of these two institutions, so that persons in these who are in these institutions feel the pressure and understand that they are they're gambling with the mandate of the people and subverting it. And even the election commission's collapse, which we've witnessed in the last few elections, is actually facilitated by the non-intervention by the Supreme Court. If the Supreme Court were to perform its duties and insist upon the election commission functioning, asking the election commission what happened to all the complaints that were made before it during election time, and asking it to give proper reports to the court, then perhaps the court could have enforced accountability. So this is one area where I think we need to work out some mechanism to make these institutions work. That is what. Another thing I would add, again, going back to the question of the mandate of the people. You see, a new generation has come after independence. Now there is a new generation which is not really familiar with our freedom movement. Just today I went for a lunch and I met somebody from Chhapra, and I said, look, I've heard that in Chhapra, the one chowk named after Mazharul Haq has been renamed. He said, oh, the Mazharul Haq, the footballer. Now, so there's a completely new generation, and we need to re-educate this generation. And how do we do it? We need, I think, to have people's committees which will conduct some programs of re-education. Now we have a very good opportunity. Dadabhai Naoroji's bicentennial birth anniversary is coming up on 4th September. And I think if we can all take it up and bring forward the whole concept of Indian nationhood and all these poverty studies and all those issues which underpinned our freedom movement, it will be a great opportunity. So these are the sort of things that were in my mind when I was hearing you, Professor Bose.
Yes. No, these are very thoughtful remarks. And, instead of simply accepting that there is popular endorsement for democratically elected authoritarianism, we should also be focusing on the problem of institutional collapse. Now, any democratically elected authoritarian leader will say that I'm simply, fulfilling my campaign promises. This is what has been happening in the first month of Trump's second term. He's simply saying that, the people have given me this mandate to bring about these dramatic changes. And it is not entirely clear that he does have genuine popular endorsement for all of the executive orders that he has been issuing. In many ways, here in the United States, as much as in India, there is a failure of the democratic opposition to gel, and there has been an institutional collapse, but including in the judiciary. But let us, just consider for a moment, the highest judiciary that we have. And, I gave an example in the course of my lecture of, what happened with the suspension of habeas corpus during the emergency. And there was a 4-1 verdict saying that this was perfectly constitutional. We can either take the view that the judiciary caved to the will of the executive, which it probably did to a certain extent, but we also need to accept that the letter of the Constitution was drafted in such a way that it was possible for 4 out of the 5 judges to provide such a literal interpretation of the Constitution. Now, I happen to think that the Justice H.R. Khanna was right, because there's always an element of judicial interpretation of the Constitution. But that is why I was saying that, where we know that there are lessons, earlier parliaments ought to have made sure that these lacuna had been somehow filled. Think of the Supreme Court waited for 5 years before taking up the abrogation of 370 and the Jammu and Kashmir Reorganization Act, and finally ruled, this time by a 5-0 verdict under Chief Justice Chandrachud, that all of this was perfectly constitutional. Again, I do think that there is an element of the judiciary caving before the will of a very strong executive. But unfortunately, what has happened is that if you just look at the letter of the Constitution, what K.T. Shah had suggested to have clearly inserted in the Constitution that you cannot change the name or the boundary or the status of any state without explicit permission from the legislature, that had not been accepted. So how farsighted was that kind of a suggestion and amendment? And therefore, the judiciary is being extremely literal in, giving the executive a lot of leeway. And that is in some ways paving the way for more of a drift towards democratic authoritarianism. So, at this stage, given the current composition of Parliament, given the way that the majority has, it's not a clear-cut majority this time for the BJP in Parliament, there can only be, popular movements, intellectuals leading broad-based civil society movements, as you say, teaching a new generation about the freedom struggle and its values and so forth. But I fear ultimately, if we are to really institute guardrails against authoritarianism, it can only happen when there is a parliamentary majority of a different kind. And I'm bringing all this up because, when we talk about the Constitution today, if you look at the popular discourse, it would appear, from the side of the opposition, it simply suggested that it was the Hindu right, talking about the Manusmriti, who were the only critics of the Constitution as it had been framed in 1950. But that is not true. Authoritarians of all stripes can be very happy with some of the features of the Constitution, which enables authoritarianism, and the judiciary will rule in their favor. And so I am trying to remind people that the more sophisticated critiques of the authoritarian inheritances in our constitutional structure came from, for example, socialists, from those who called themselves socialists in those days. And we should not forget those kinds of critiques, because that, in some ways, can be the basis of democratic politics for the opposition.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah.
Vasanti, please go ahead.
I did not raise my hand, but still, now that my name has been called, now the basic solution is the mass awakening, and a truly federal and a truly egalitarian also alternative rises. Now, how do we create this mass movement? Where does it stand? Do we have signs of any kind of leadership that can sow the seeds of this kind of an awakening? Is there anywhere in India you see the possibility of building, of drawing examples, drawing models of this kind of a mass awakening against democratic authoritarianism?
Again, you're asking a very difficult question. I think you're right that the only answer is a mass awakening, but as you have seen from other members of the group, there is some pessimism, and there seems to be a sense that there is at least a certain degree of popular endorsement for authoritarian leaders that we see. What I would say is that I think there are disparate movements which probably need to be brought together in some way. For example, there are people who are engaged in environmental movements. There are movements for women's rights and gender rights, which perhaps are not as strong as they used to be a few years ago, but they do certainly exist. There are powerful movements for the empowerment of subordinated castes, even though, as we have seen, the ruling party has been able to win over substantial support from even the other backward castes and Dalits. And they have, in fact, been trying to, appropriate, Ambedkar as well in, some of their political rhetoric. So in some ways, I think the only way to think about the future is to bring together disparate strands of democratic struggles in a meaningful way. We are talking about federalism and egalitarianism, and I read out to you something from Subhash Chandra Bose's speech from the Maharashtra Political Conference of 1928. But I was actually trying to read what was he saying in 1929 when he was an advocate of Purna Swaraj, of course. But it was, in fact, very enlightening for me to see that in the same year that he was advocating for Purna Swaraj, of course, in December 1928, he had wanted Purna Swaraj and not dominion status, and his amendment was defeated at the Calcutta Congress. And a year later, the Purna Swaraj resolution was accepted. But alongside Purna Swaraj, he was, already talking about what he called Purna Samyavada in 1929. And let me just read out to you what he said in Bengali. I just was reading that in a speech in Medinipur. This is what he's saying. পূর্ণ সাম্যবাদের উপর নূতন সমাজকে গড়িয়া তুলিতে হইবে। জাতিভেদের অচল আয়তনকে একেবারে ধূলিসাৎ করিতে হইবে। নারীকে সর্বভাবে মুক্ত করিয়া সমাজে ও রাষ্ট্রে পুরুষের সহিত সমান অধিকার ও দায়িত্ব প্রদান করিতে হইবে। অর্থের বৈষম্য দূর করিতে হইবে এবং বর্ণ ধর্ম নির্বিশেষে প্রত্যেকে কি পুরুষ কি নারী যাহাতে শিক্ষার ও উন্নতির সমান সুযোগ ও সুবিধা পায় তার ব্যবস্থা করিতে হইবে। Now, I think you may have got the gist of what he was saying, even though this is Shadhu Bangla. But he's basically saying that a new society has to be built on the foundation of Purna Samyavada. And then he's bringing the different elements together. What he's saying is that the caste system has to be just reduced to dust, he's saying. Dhulishat korite hoibe. Now, this is very different from saying that we will give, resources to every caste based on their numbers. I mean, this is a call for the complete destruction of the caste system with all its iniquities, its discrimination, its exploitation, its oppression, and so on. Then he's bringing in, women have to be liberated completely, and in both society and the state must be given equal rights and equal responsibilities. So he's bringing in caste, gender. He's also talking about orther boshammo. Economic inequality has to be, abolished. And then, very importantly, regardless of borno, dharmo, caste, religion, gender, he's demanding equal rights and access to education and, unnati development and so on. Now, in addition to that, of course, I mean, we have what I feel very frustrated about in Indian politics today is that, there needs to be a certain futurism in our politics. And, if the younger generation are to be, inspired, we also have to think about, what inheritance we are going to leave them. And there, the state of our planet, environmental concerns, climate justice are extremely important, and they are not central in our oppositional politics today. So in addition to educating them about the values of the freedom struggle, which they may not know about, there are ways in which we can directly address what would be the concerns of the younger generation in the not so distant future. In fact, we are living through that climate crisis even today. So I think the only way we can go towards this mass awakening that you're talking about is to perhaps somehow combine or bring together the different strands of, democratic movements or struggles that we can find in different parts of the country today.
Before I invite Shukla Sen Saab, I will just request Bhargav to raise question in the chat box.
Yeah.
Some question.
Yes. There is a question from Mr. Rajiv Rai. I just read that out. And thanks, Professor Bose, for throwing some new light on the preparation of current Indian constitution telling us about few stalwarts in the debate that we were even knowing before. Can you give some concrete points to political parties which are talking of saving the constitution, should say strongly that furthers real democracy and simultaneously appeals to people in India too? Briefly, what points should opposition parties should vouch for furthering the constitution aggressively and firmly than being defensive to just whatever exists as of now?
Yes. So, I would urge the opposition and the leader of the opposition, not to, simply go around, holding the book and sort of showing it. And also, if you go to the Dalits and, and tell the audience that this is sort of your constitution, it is not the entire truth. Of course, we have to protect and even strengthen, constitutional rights for our subordinated castes, and we have to make sure that we protect and strengthen, whatever rights they have, both the Dalits and the Adivasis and so on. But I would basically say that, I've pointed out where, let's say, the judiciary is, just able to look at the letter of certain constitutional clauses and rule in favor of an authoritarian executive. And I think it would be truly incumbent on the opposition to say that, when we at the next election win a majority, we will make sure that we plug these loopholes, that we will not allow this kind of a drift towards authoritarianism. And what I would also say is that the biggest failure within our constitutional structure was that we did not accept the best ideas that were present in our anti-colonial political and economic thought, which would have given us genuine federalism. And I explained why this happened. For example, partition itself was a failure of anti-colonial federalism at the last moment, and partition then contributed to a certain kind of an atmosphere when there was a sense that we must, have a more centralized state, that there has been a division, and we, must not give too many, rights to the regions and states and so on. And I think the opposition should come together and basically say that we will oppose any attempt to amend the constitution which will go in a more religious majoritarian direction, or which will potentially deprive our subordinated communities of their rights. But we are not taking a status quoist position. When we, come to power, we would be prepared to debate and discuss and possibly pass constitutional amendments that will strengthen both egalitarianism, but also create a more federal union, which I'm certain will be a stronger union. And therefore, I would even think in terms of being able to say that we will, we will amend to change the composition of the upper house, which does not play any valuable role in the current situation, so that, states which in terms of population are fearful of losing representation, their concerns can be assuaged, and we genuinely, build a union of states where everyone feels a sense of belonging, everyone feels a sense of having a voice in decision making at the federal center. So those are the kinds of proposals that I would put, before the people in the different states. I would probably put the language of caste and class egalitarianism more strongly in northern India, in UP and Bihar and so forth. And I would, in some ways, assuage the genuine concerns that I hear from the South by saying that we would be prepared to make our constitutional more genuinely federal if we are able to gain support and a majority.
I will
Subhash,
request. Yeah,
Subhash,
Ravi, please go ahead.
I would like to come in, but Shukla Sen have raised his hand, so if you can invite him to say whatever he wants to say.
Shukla Sen Saab, please unmute yourself and.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Am I audible?
Yeah, audible, perfectly audible.
Okay, thank you so much. Actually, congratulations, and more than that, thanks to Professor Bose for such a highly informed talk. I would, so far I'm concerned, your talk has got essentially two parts. What happened in the past, how the Constitution came into being, what were the different opinions, etc. And the second part is what do you do now? Main part of the talk was history. The questions that have come till now essentially all relate to what do you do now. I will go back to history. My point is this, that Indian federalism and Indian national movement, it had a sort of, it was two-minded in a sense. Indian nationalism claimed that India is an emerging nation. All at the same time, it also claimed that it's an ancient nation, as the Hindu nationalism did. Fine. But on the ground, the Indian national leaders were extremely aware that Indian nation is being actually sued together by the Indian independence movement itself. There was no Indian nation prior to that. That's why Gandhi is the father of the nation, which none other than Subhash Bose himself anointed him. Fine. So the point is, having recognized that, they understood or they concluded that you need a sort of a combination of consent and coercion in order to build the nation, or rather in order to make the nation. The independent Indian state will have to play a major role, and they saw the role as a central authority which will have coercion, all the coercive apparatuses in its hand. That is one point. And the second point is this: Indian National Congress made clear declaration that Indian states will be linguistic states. Yet after the independence, there was absolute animosity towards linguistic states. People had to die in order to demand for linguistic state. In case of Bengal, the linguistic state was already there, that was attempted to be obliterated. Now, many of us didn't like it. We hated it, no doubt about it. But the fact remains, the Indian leaders saw ethno-linguistic nationalism as a competitor of Indian nationalism, quote-unquote nationalism. So therefrom that enmity flowed, to my understanding. Similarly with partition, etc. My point is this: that point has to be kept in mind, while we are telling. Beautiful things were told, but on the ground, the people who were actually steering, they were probably far more pragmatic, and in a sense, states have dissolved. Many states have dissolved, which looked far more formidable. Indian state, which looked extremely shaky in the beginning, that still exists today in spite of the deep crisis it is facing. That's all. Comment.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. And yes, of course, the Indian nation was in the process of its, making during the independence struggle. But every nation, even if it is modern, always makes a claim to antiquity, and so was the case with Indian nationalism. Now, the way that I would respond to your very insightful comments is that that first of all, I've talked about the political tradition of federalism, the envisioning of India as a union of states. And you're absolutely right that it was Mahatma Gandhi who had promised linguistic states in 1920. That was a cardinal principle of the Indian independence movement. But initially, after independence, there was an attempt not to have linguistic states, and you're right that it was seen as a competitor in the field of nationalism. But we have a very robust intellectual tradition as well of federalism, and there are younger scholars who have been working on it. If you just think about the 1920s, there were I mentioned a political leader, Deshabandhu Chittaranjan Das, but there were political thinkers like Radhakammal Mukherjee, Brajendranath Seal, who had very sophisticated views on, India as a federal, union of states. And we sometimes forget that even in a country like China, there were important intellectuals who thought of China as a federal union of states. And they both felt, and I've argued this in my new book, Asia After Europe, that it's only a federal India and a federal China which could come together in a broader Asiatic federation. Those were the dreams of that era. Now, I am not in favor of giving, those who advocated coercion from the center an easy pass. I think it is always important to have informed consent from the constituent units of a federal union of states. And here, since some of you have formed a new socialist initiative, I just want to say that the socialists became somewhat divided after independence, something which I indicated in my lecture. Nehru's socialism became something of a statism. He veered towards favoring a strong, centralized state. On the other hand, there were many other socialists who were not as powerful as India's first prime minister, but who had taken part in the Indian freedom struggle. And I mentioned a couple of them, K.T. Shah, Meghnad Shah, and so on, who had worked closely with Nehru, but they were socialists and federalists at the same time. They did not believe that socialism, in its genuine sense of trying to achieve equality, necessarily needed a strong centralized state. That, in the Indian situation, it would be much better to have a federal state with autonomy for the constituent units and a reasonable sharing of power among the constituent units at the federal center. And since my grandfather was mentioned in the introduction, I might add that he was trying in the last years of his life to form a united socialist organization. He had been with the Congress all his life, from the Swadeshi movement up to 1947. But when the Congress High Command accepted partition and decreed the partition of Punjab and Bengal, he left. And I was just looking at who he was trying to contact in the late 1940s and so on. And so, for example, I find that he's trying to contact K.T. Shah, who was from Gujarat, from Kutch actually. He's trying to contact Indulal Yagnik. And of course, there were other socialists as well at that time, Jawaharlal Nehru, Ram Manohar Lohia, Jayaprakash Narayan, Ram Manohar Lohia, and so on. So I am trying to urge you to rediscover that political and intellectual tradition, which combined socialism, or a belief in what Subhash Chandra Bose called Samyavada, with also a genuine commitment to federalism. Socialists can go in the centralist direction. They can also go in the federalist direction. And I think in order to oppose authoritarianism that we face today, it is important to go in the federalist direction and always insist that the consent of the constituent units can be the only basis for a genuine, strong, prosperous, union of India. Unfortunately, many of the people whom I mentioned in today's lecture died soon after the Republic was founded. For example, my grandfather, Sharat Chandra Bose, who defeated the Congress candidate in a South Calcutta by-election in July of 1949, passed away in February of 1950. K.T. Shah died soon after he lost the presidential election. I think he passed away in 1953. There was, of course, the Praja Socialist Party and then the Sanjukta Socialist Party, which played some kind of a role in the politics of the first 2 decades of independent India. But some of the stalwarts who believed in a blend of socialism and federalism were not there on the scene to lead a successful effort in those days. Since you went back into history, I thought I would also say something about the history of that period, even while we consider what is to be done in the present.
Ravi, please.
Okay,
You're audible.
okay. Sorry for coming in for the second time. And I just, there is such a nice discussion going on. So let me ask a question which may appear to be outside the topic of today's Professor Bose's talk, but I think it connects with that. I would not like to come off as if I have lost all hope in the masses. Yes, I mean, if you lose all hope in the masses, where do you go in politics? And I am not saying that the present authoritarian leaders who have come through democracy to power are endorsed by all of Indian people or all the masses. Yet we face a challenge. We are talking about democracy, but let us talk about nation, the nation, the identity, national identity. And their slogan of Hindu nation finds a very strong traction in the political arena. And I would like to kind of say that, from us, our left, from the side of left, class struggle, slogan of class struggle, and from the side of left as well as many liberal forces and so on, the rainbow of many social movements and slogans of human rights, and including, as Professor Bose was saying, the issues of related to climate change and so on. They have not added up to challenge this grand narrative that the Hindutva authoritarians have come up with, namely that of Hindu nation. So my question is that, the failure of the liberals and the leftists in India is real. And we cannot understand it only on the basis of subjective forces, that the political forces themselves did not do things right. So that may be true, but such a large failure or such a large challenge cannot be understood just by the weaknesses of the political forces. There may be some structural or maybe more deeper reasons. So my question is that, can we think about what could be that kind of grand narrative that could confront the slogan of Hindu nation that has such a traction? And this problem is all over the world, not just in India. Some kind of identity or race-based or religion-based idea of nation has large traction, and mostly right-wing forces have taken advantage of that. Now, if we are not able to confront that with class struggle, human rights, climate change, or social justice, and if we are not able to put together a bouquet of these slogans and movements to confront this very solid-looking Hindu nation, do you think some other grand narrative which somehow explains the India being together on a competing basis, on a basis that can challenge the Hindutva narrative, that kind of grand narrative is also needed. That is often we discuss in NSI, in New Socialist Initiative, this issue, that whether some kind of, even though it's a very difficult, I know it's a very dangerous even idea, but some kind of civilizational nation to confront Hindutva nation, some kind of civilizational nation to confront religious nation or identity-based nation. Do you think that one should think about that, or it is too dangerous? It takes us to in the Hitler's direction.
I don't like the adjective civilizational, because if you delve into modern history, it's the Western imperialists who basically utilized this discourse of civilization versus barbarism in their entire process of colonial conquest of Asia and Africa. But of course, if we decide to look at the Indian language cognates for that term, we may be better off. I mean, if you think about Rabindranath writing Shobhota Shankot, Crisis of Civilization, in the last year of his life, if we are able to use the term in that way, we may have some traction. But what I will say in response to your question and comment is that simply relying on doctrinaire versions of class struggle will not get us anywhere. Nation still, has a deep, popular appeal. And so we ought not to abandon the domain of nation and nationalism to religious majoritarianism. And that's not the only way that we can imagine our Indian nation. And that is the context in which re-educating our younger generation about the values of the freedom struggle may actually be quite important. I was faced with a real challenge when I was giving a speech in Parliament in the 16th sort of Lok Sabha, and I actually decided to assert that I am a nationalist, even though there are many, particularly in the West, see the word nationalist, only to be pejorative, that it's the lesser other than compared to cosmopolitan and so forth. And I said so because, in our context, the term nationalist is so entwined with our freedom struggle that I think we ought to be able to make a distinction that, we are nationalists in the sense that nationalism inspires us to be of service to our fellow human beings. Nationalism inspires our creative faculties. But we are opposed to any kind of nationalism which is narrow, selfish, arrogant, and which in the past has basically expressed itself in nationalistic imperialism. So I think it should not be impossible to articulate a version of, shall I say, enlightened nationalism, a broad-minded, generous form of nationalism, which is not simply drawing on a religious majority or a racial majority. We are seeing the rise of white nationalism in the United States and many other parts of Europe. In India, it may be religion. Here, it is sort of race. And I think we ought to be able to challenge this notion of majority. Ambedkar was saying that this is actually a communal majority. It's not a political majority, because the British decided to enumerate us in a certain way based on religion and caste and so on. They rank ordered caste and made it more hierarchical than before. They looked at religion, not just in India, but in Ireland, if you look at Protestant and Catholic, and said, on the basis of religious or sectarian enumeration, one is a majority and the other is a minority, or others are minorities. And that can't be the basis for genuine substantive democracy, where a majority has to be earned with support from a whole variety of people. And so I think that the reason why I still hark back for the freedom struggle is that we do have alternative conceptions of nationalism that are as compelling, as appealing as any, religiously tinged nationalism might be.
Bhargav, please.
Yeah, Subhash. There is one comment and question from one of the friends from the chat box. Malati is raising this question. Thank you very much for this wonderful speech, sir. Your optimistic views raised our spirits. And you were mentioning that the Constitution should not be used for mere use of power, but the spirit of Constitution should be practiced. I'm paraphrasing them. But we cannot expect democratically elected authoritarian leaders to even agree to the spirit of Constitution. In that case, what has to be done to make the spirit of Constitution as a large objective before the society?
Well, I don't expect democratically elected authoritarian leaders to abide by the spirit of the Constitution, or in fact, what I described as the basic elements of our anti-colonial constitutionalism. So I'm not, hoping for authoritarian leaders to do that. In fact, what they will do is to simply focus on the letter of the constitutional in a very partial way, looking at certain clauses which enable their authoritarianism to get judicial sanction. That's exactly what has been sort of going on. My message today was directed much more to, fellow intellectuals, fellow leaders of civil society, and also, I would say, to the opposition, which I think is making a big mistake by simply taking what I have described as a status quoist position on the letter of the Constitution, and not really focusing more on both the spirit of the Constitution, the ways in which even our Constitution can be made more democratic, egalitarian, federal. And, when faced with a very robust, democratically elected authoritarian regime, just relying on a status quo is not the answer. And this is not the Indian situation either. Look at what happened in the United States of America. The Democrats were also relying on the Constitution, that Trump will come and he will undermine our constitutional rights. But at least in America, the intellectuals understand that there are huge problems with constitutional originalism. That, all right, the Constitution in America proclaimed, the goal to be life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But what was Martin Luther King saying in the 1950s and 1960s? That, the United States does not live up to those values. And in some ways, Trump is wanting to take America back to the era before the civil rights movement, and maybe relying on certain features of the US Constitution as it was before it was made more democratic. And that's why I'm saying that instead of being afraid of having a discussion about our constitutional legacy and our constitutional future, and simply saying that we are defending the Constitution, let us be bold enough to engage in a debate about what is genuine democracy, what is substantive democracy. How can our young generation come forward and help even our constitutional structure to be more democratic, more federal, more egalitarian? So that is the way to stop the misuse of certain parts of the Constitution towards authoritarian ends, and also the threat that is often posed of, turning India into a religious majoritarian kind of republic.
Now we are moving towards concluding the meeting, but before we conclude, I will just request Anant Padke. He is there with us. Does he want to raise some question? Anant? Ananta? No, he's not there. Yeah, anyway. So
yes.
Yeah.
No,
Ananta, please.
my only comment, it's an excellent lecture and excellent debate. My only comment is that the whole debate has, because of lack of time, has completely neglected the whole issue of political economy. The deterioration of democracy in India is substantially also because of the rise of crony capitalism, because of which only a few guys can control the economy, the media, and the political party. I think when we talk about the progress or regression of democracy in India, apart from the problems with constitutional provisions, we should also consider the development of political economy of India, which is fundamentally problematic on one hand. But at the same time, we should also see, if you want to be hopeful, that the level of education compared to pre-independence India, the level of education, of political awareness, of reach, of communication, all this has increased tremendously. On one, and the aspirations and the experience of democratic functioning is far more than what it was in pre-independence India. And therefore, when we talk about the prospects of democracy, I think we have to see the contradiction between, on one hand, this crony capitalism, which has basically helped the BJP, versus the higher level of potential that the Indian economy and the society and its democratic tradition have. And it is this contradiction which will decide which way we are going to go. So while we can be somewhat pessimistic, we should also take into account the issue of higher education, higher political awareness, etc., and also the practice of whatever limited democracy that we had during last 75 years compared to the British Raj. And if we could throw away the British Raj, we can also dream of throwing away the rule of the crony capitalism as well as dictatorial tendencies. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. You're right that we didn't sufficiently address the political economy dimension of democracy and authoritarianism in India, or indeed the world today. I did at least fleetingly refer to the dangers of gross economic inequality. And when I spoke of egalitarianism as one of the pillars on which any political or social movement has to be based, I had that in mind. But you're absolutely right that it's not just any kind of crony capitalism, but it is a kind of an alliance between a democratically elected authoritarian leader or regime and the wealthiest and richest among the capitalists today. So here in the United States, of course, if there is one person who is actually more powerful than Trump, who's generally seen to be the most powerful man in the world, it is Elon Musk. And in India, it is again, a couple of plutocrats who are very closely entangled with a democratically elected authoritarian leader and regime. So yes, I agree with you, and there should be more discussion on political economy. After all, much of my earlier work was in economic history and political economy, so I acknowledge the importance of looking at that dimension. But I'm glad that at the very end of the discussion, you injected an optimistic note that perhaps there is more political awareness in India today. The only worry that I have is that there are so many who belong to the so-called educated classes who are lending support to democratically elected authoritarianism in India, which is not quite the case in the United States, because here it is the less educated who are the base for Donald Trump. And therefore, we probably need to give some thought to the kind of education that we have been imparting. But given that qualification, I do see, prospects of a higher degree of political awareness, particularly among the younger generation, which should lead us not to lose faith in the Indian people or indeed India's political destiny in the future.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. In an ambience of pessimism and lethargy, what the presentation you have made, your presentation raises very interesting questions, and it needs the way we need to creatively look at those challenges before us. How we need to enhance the spirit of the Constitution in our struggle. All those things. I think we had a very interesting discussion, and thank you very much for sparing time for us, sir, and also for the participants that you stayed. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.